They will tell you that silence protects the living, but in places like the Pritchard estate, silence was nothing but a shroud stretched over graves without names. Imagine this: 47 brides, each dressed in white, each smiling at the thought of a future, each vanishing into the black maw of a house built not for love, but for something else, something colder, something older. That house still stands, though in ruins, in the rolling hills of western Georgia, a few miles from the town of Carterville. Its stone walls are split, its roof caved in, its corridors invaded by weeds and dust. And yet, if you step inside, you feel it. The hush is too deep, too unnatural. The echoes are wrong, as though something waits for you to speak so it can remember your voice forever. The locals don't talk about the Pritchards. Their name is gone from official records, erased as if it never existed. But the earth keeps secrets longer than men do. And in 1987, when a rusted trunk was unearthed from beneath the collapsed cellar floor, the silence ended. Inside were documents, contracts, journals, receipts, and letters, stained with mildew, brittle as autumn leaves. What they described was so methodical, so ritualistic, that even the historical societies refused to authenticate them. Refused. Do you understand how rare that is? For men whose careers depend on collecting fragments of truth, to suddenly turn away from it, to declare, "This is too dangerous, this should not be spoken." That's what we're dealing with tonight. So I'll ask you this before we go further. Where are you watching this from? Tell me in the comments. Let me know the soil beneath your feet, because geography matters in stories like this. Some places are built to hold secrets better than others, and when you hear what the Pritchards did, you will never look at the idea of a wedding night the same way again. No, listen. The Pritchard family was not just another planter dynasty. Cornelius the patriarch didn't care for the pageantry of southern aristocracy. He built his estate deliberately away from the main road, carved from stone, isolated by water crossings, hidden behind winding paths that even locals avoided after dusk. Neighbors said it was efficient, but men who build walls like that, they aren't avoiding neighbors. They're preparing a stage where no one can witness what happens inside. And what happened inside was a cycle perfected over 2 decades. Each of the 5 Pritchard sons, Jeremiah, Obadiah, Ezekiel, Matthias, Caleb, would disappear for months at a time. When they returned, they claimed to have found a bride, always young, always alone, always from families broken by tragedy or poverty, and always, without exception, she vanished within weeks of arriving at the plantation. Neighbors heard stories, whispers carried through cracked windows at night, lanterns moving in unnatural patterns between the main house and the outbuildings, wagons rolling out before dawn, their wheels muffled in mud, muffled cries drifting across the river, fading into the cicadas, and always the same explanation: she had fallen ill, she was delicate, she was too frail for visitors. The family mourned in private. But tell me this, if a man loses one wife to illness, perhaps it is tragedy. If 5 brothers lose dozens of wives the exact same way, and no graves are ever seen, no funerals ever held, that is not tragedy. That is a design. That is a pattern. And the pattern began in September of 1843, with Jeremiah Pritchard bringing home his first bride, Sarah Peaton, a blacksmith's daughter, barely 19, desperate to escape the ruin her father's death had left behind. She entered that house on a cool autumn night, hidden in a canvas-covered carriage, and she was never seen again. Do you feel it yet? That unease in your stomach, that chill on the back of your neck? That's not fear, that's recognition, because deep down you know what this story is about. It isn't just the Pritchards, it's about what powerful men do when no one is watching. It's about the systems they build to trap the innocent. It's about the masks they wear. Husbands, leaders, protectors, while hiding the predator within. Tonight, you're going to see the mask fall, and once you do, you will never forget it. Sarah Peaton's name should have been carved into stone somewhere in Georgia, perhaps on a weathered headstone beneath a willow tree. Instead, it vanished, absorbed into the black maw of the Pritchard plantation. And if not for the trunk found in 1987, history would have buried her forever. In those brittle pages, her story begins not with a wedding dress, but with contracts. written agreements between Jeremiah and unknown third parties. Her name appeared not as a beloved bride, but as an acquisition. The handwriting is careful, almost mechanical, detailing expenses not for flowers or rings, but for preparations, reinforcement of quarters, and ensuring compliance. Tell me, what kind of wedding requires reinforced locks? What kind of bride needs compliance? Neighbors remembered Jeremiah's excuses. He said Sarah was delicate, nervous, too frail to meet strangers. He told them she had fallen ill, that her modesty forbade her from receiving a doctor. At first, polite society accepted these stories. But some began to whisper. Why had no one ever seen Sarah outside the estate? Why did the Pritchard's servants, who lived nearly a mile from the house, avoid mentioning her at all? And then there were the sounds. Mrs. Eleanor Fairchild, whose property touched the edge of the Pritchard land, wrote in her diary of muffled cries carried on the wind, the rattle of wagon wheels before dawn, the flicker of lanterns moving back and forth between the cellar doors and the riverbank. She convinced herself it must have been animals or the echo of storms across the valley, but when Sarah disappeared completely, replaced only by Jeremiah's quiet claim that she had succumbed to a sudden fever, Mrs. Fairchild's words took on a different weight. But Sarah's vanishing was not an accident, not a one-time horror. It was the prototype, a ritual. Months later, Obadiah returned with his own bride, Charlotte Hicks, a dockworker's daughter from Savannah, also young, also alone, also desperate for a way out. Her arrival was hidden in the same way, a covered carriage at night, 3 days of silence, then weeks of whispered excuses. And like Sarah, Charlotte was gone before the season turned. By then the whispers in Carterville had grown sharper. 2 young brides in less than a year, both swallowed by the Pritchard estate, both replaced by stories of mysterious illness and nervous fragility. Dr. Marcus Hewitt, the town physician, pressed for access but was denied. The Pritchards insisted the women feared examination, feared outsiders, feared light itself. Hewitt knew something was wrong. He even tried unannounced visits. Each time he was turned away at the door by the overseers. Tobias Hartwell, Duncan Lowry, and Silas Vance, men whose backgrounds were as fogged as their masters' intentions. What strikes hardest is the precision. The Pritchards were not reckless criminals stumbling through chaos. They were calculated. Every detail was rehearsed. The secrecy of travel, the choice of vulnerable women, the isolation of the estate, the rehearsed explanations for illness, the consistent rotation of brothers traveling so there was always a steady supply of new victims. This wasn't madness. It was design. Think about that, because history likes to tell us that evil is chaotic, irrational, the product of diseased minds. But here, evil was systematic. It was organized. It was deliberate. And when evil wears a suit of order, it becomes almost invisible. That's why neighbors didn't act. That's why the community excused the disappearances, because the Pritchards cloaked their cruelty in the language of respectability. And that's where this story begins to scrape against something larger. Because once you see how this family operated, how they used institutions and appearances and social customs to cloak predation, you'll start to notice the pattern everywhere, in politics, in corporations, in history books. It is always the same: power hiding behind ritual, control disguised as tradition, predators disguised as protectors. Sarah and Charlotte were not the only ones. They were just the beginning. And the deeper we go, the more chilling the consistency becomes. By the spring of 1845, the whispers around Carterville had grown teeth. 2 brides gone in less than a year, both hidden behind the heavy oak doors of the Pritchard estate, both explained away with vague illnesses and convenient tragedies. But when the 3rd bride arrived, suspicion became something darker, a silent pact of fear. Ezekiel, the 3rd brother, returned from Tennessee with his bride-to-be, Margaret Hale, only 17, daughter of a farmer ruined by debt and forced to sell his land. To the neighbors, Margaret seemed like every girl before her, desperate for security, drawn in by the Pritchards' wealth and isolated by her lack of family protection. Ezekiel spoke of her purity, her obedience, her humble spirit, always the same words, always the same excuses. And like the others, Margaret entered the plantation at night under cover of a canvas-draped carriage. No one saw her face, no one heard her voice. The doors closed, the lanterns flickered, and within days the explanations began again. Margaret had fallen ill, Margaret was too delicate, Margaret could not be disturbed. Neighbors began to talk among themselves, but not aloud in the streets. Always in whispers, always behind closed doors, because by now the Pritchards were no longer just wealthy planters, they were something else, untouchable. Their cotton yields exceeded every neighbor's. Their business dealings were precise, almost unnervingly so. Their overseers moved like men trained not in farming, but in something sharper, harder, the discipline of control. No one could say exactly why, but people sensed it. If you pressed the Pritchards too far, something would happen to you. And that is how fear works, not with proof, not with evidence, but with the cold weight of possibility, the fear that if you speak too loudly, you'll vanish too. Dr. Hewitt, still uneasy, made one final attempt. He arrived unannounced at the estate with his medical bag, insisting on examining Margaret. He was turned away again, this time not with polite words, but with Duncan Lowry's hand tightening on the barrel of a shotgun resting against his shoulder. The message was clear: leave or be carried out. From that day forward, Hewitt stopped asking. He stopped visiting. He carried his silence like a wound. Margaret Hale disappeared just as Sarah and Charlotte had. No grave, no funeral, no body, just a story. Another fragile bride too delicate for this world. And this is the moment, right here, where you see how the mask tightens, because by the third disappearance, the town should have risen. The ministers should have demanded answers. The law should have intervened, but they didn't. They wouldn't. Why? Because fear is only half the answer. The other half is complicity. The Pritchards contributed generously to churches, to road building, to schools. They shook hands in town, paid debts promptly, and smiled with the dignity of men who appeared righteous. Their wealth bought silence, their ritual of tragedy numbed suspicion, and their distance from social circles insulated them from scrutiny. It was a perfect design, and the people around them, out of fear, greed, or willful blindness, allowed it to continue. Think about that. Because this is where the story stops being about a single family in Georgia. This is where it becomes a mirror. The Pritchards were not the first to build a fortress of silence, and they were not the last. Every empire, every institution that survives centuries has done so by hiding its crimes behind ceremony and respectability. And if you've ever wondered why the darkest truths of history remain buried, it's because entire communities, entire nations, find it easier to look away. Margaret's name should have ended the Pritchard reign. Instead, it became another link in the chain, another perfected step in their system of disappearance. 3 brides gone, 44 more yet to come, and no one dared to stand in the way. By the time Matthias Pritchard returned with his bride in 1847, the pattern was no longer coincidence. It had calcified into ritual. Her name was Eleanor Frost, barely 18, daughter of a merchant ruined by fire in Charleston. A girl stripped of options, hungry for stability, and grateful to be chosen by a wealthy Southern heir. On paper, it was a rescue. In reality, it was a sentence. Eleanor's arrival carried the same hallmarks as the others. The canvas-draped carriage rolling in at dusk, the 3 days of silence, the absence of witnesses, the sudden illness that kept her locked inside. But this time, neighbors noticed something new. They spoke of strange music drifting faintly across the fields at night, not the fiddle tunes of wedding feasts, but low, droning sounds, rhythms that didn't belong to church or celebration. Some swore they heard chanting, others said it was just the wind bending through the hollow corridors of the stone house, but those who listened closely described it as layered voices, rising and falling in patterns too deliberate to be chance. Eleanor was never seen again. Jeremiah explained she had suffered a seizure. Obadiah added that she was buried quietly, according to her wishes. But no grave was marked, no pastor officiated, no record existed, just silence, sealed by wealth and fear. And then came Caleb, the youngest, in 1849. His bride was Lydia Morrow, only 16, taken from a collapsing farmstead in Virginia after her parents died of cholera. The youngest, the most vulnerable, the easiest to isolate. Her disappearance echoed the others, but this time, one neighbor, Mrs. Henrietta Cumberland, wrote in her diary that she had seen something far more chilling. Men carrying objects from the house down toward the Etowah River at midnight, long, heavy bundles wrapped in cloth, stained dark even under the moonlight. She swore she saw one of the bundles move. When she mentioned it to her husband, he told her to forget what she saw. He told her the Pritchards were powerful men, that raising accusations without proof could destroy their family. And so her words stayed in ink, sealed in a diary that would not resurface for over a century. Here, the pattern sharpened into something undeniable. 5 brothers, 5 brides, 5 vanishings, each a young woman cut off from protection, each cloaked in the same narrative of illness, each leaving behind no grave, no witness, no record. And yet the community did nothing, because the Pritchards had crafted something stronger than chains or weapons, a prison of perception. They built their crimes inside the boundaries of what society already believed. Women were fragile, women were nervous, women were prone to illness. The lie worked because it echoed cultural truth. This is how control operates, not by brute force alone, but by weaving itself into the stories people already accept. That's why no one fought back. That's why silence stretched across the valley. Because to accuse the Pritchards would mean accusing the very structure of Southern life, the beliefs about gender, power, and hierarchy that held society together, and who among them was willing to tear down the order of their world. So the disappearances continued, not as random acts of cruelty, but as rehearsed ritual. 47 women would walk into that house over 20 years, each believing she was chosen, each never returning. And the house itself seemed to transform with every loss. Its windows stayed shuttered longer, its halls grew quieter, the overseers lingered closer to the cellar doors, and the people of Carterville grew accustomed to the silence, numbed to the horror just beyond the river. 5 brides gone, 42 yet to vanish, and not one hand raised to stop it. By the 5th disappearance, the story was no longer just about the brides. It was about the people watching, the neighbors, the churchgoers, the merchants who shook the Pritchards' hands and accepted their donations while silently burying their unease. And that's the part you need to understand. The women weren't the only victims. The entire town was being conditioned. Think of it this way. The first disappearance was shock, the second was coincidence, the third was suspicion. By the 4th and 5th, it wasn't just a pattern, it was training. The Pritchards were teaching the community how to respond. Each time a bride vanished, the explanations grew smoother. Each time neighbors questioned, they were silenced by wealth, by ritual, by fear of social exile. And slowly, the unthinkable became the inevitable. That's how psychological control works. It doesn't arrive with chains and threats. It arrives with repetition. It whispers, "This is normal, this is acceptable, this is none of your concern." And once the mind accepts that, no one has to enforce silence anymore. People silence themselves. The overseers were the visible enforcers. The men with shotguns at the gates, the figures moving lanterns through the night. But the real overseer was the story itself, the illusion that each bride was delicate, each death private, each tragedy contained, and the community played along. Ministers preached patience, merchants welcomed the brothers into town. Even Dr. Hewitt, who had come closest to seeing the truth, withdrew into silence after the barrel of a gun pressed too near his ribs. This is the most disturbing revelation. The system didn't need to hide its crimes perfectly. It only needed to make resistance more costly than acceptance. And that's exactly what the Pritchards perfected. Each vanishing reinforced the lesson. Keep quiet, and you survive. Now pause for a moment. To look at the world around you today, ask yourself, how many times have you watched a system operate in plain sight, doing what everyone knows is wrong, yet no one speaks because the story has already been written for them? How many times has power cloaked itself in ritual, in respectability, in wealth, so no one dares to challenge it? The Pritchards weren't unique. They were a microcosm of something larger. That's why this tale survived, not just because it's macabre, but because it's a mirror showing how predators train their prey. Not with violence first, but with silence. not by killing the body, but by breaking the will of those who might resist. By the end of the 1840s, the Pritchard plantation was no longer just a house on the hill. It was a stage. Every lantern flicker, every closed carriage, every muffled cry rehearsed the same story, until the community itself became part of the ritual, not participants by choice, but by surrender. And once a people surrenders to silence, the predator's power becomes absolute. 5 brides gone, the lesson complete, and the descent was only beginning. When the trunk was pried open in 1987, no one expected the contents to rewrite a century of silence. Mold had eaten at the leather, the iron hinges nearly collapsed into rust. Inside were papers layered in mildew, a faint smell of river mud clinging to them, as if the documents themselves remembered the soil they'd been buried beneath. At first glance they looked ordinary. Receipts for grain, ledgers of cotton shipments, handwritten letters. But as archivists began reading deeper, the illusion shattered. These weren't just family papers, they were instructions, rituals written in plain language, disguised as household records. One page listed accommodations for incoming bride. Beneath it, expenditures for iron reinforcement, heavy oak doors, and locks, sourced discreetly. Another listed preparations for cleansing, with quantities of lime and lye far beyond what any household would require. There were notes about cessation of sound, paired with the purchase of heavy canvas and horsehair padding, items used in soundproofing. But the most disturbing entries were the ledgers that listed the brides not as women, but as assets. Each name followed by strange annotations: yield, duration, condition, as if their lives had been reduced to experiments. And beside some of the names, an additional mark, a symbol that did not match any known shorthand of the era. A circle pierced by a downward stroke, like a keyhole staring back at you. The journals, written in the hand of Cornelius himself, carried the most damning details. He wrote not like a grieving father-in-law mourning fragile young women, but like an overseer running a program. He referred to the brides as candidates. He described their selection as deliberate, chosen from broken families, vulnerable backgrounds, isolated from protection. He emphasized that each arrival required secrecy, each transition required control, and each departure must leave no trace. But in between the cold instructions were hints of something older, fragments of scripture not from any Bible, but twisted echoes of it. Cornelius wrote of the purification of lineage, of removing weakness from the line, of binding innocence to strengthen the foundation. His words blurred the line between obsession and doctrine, as if the disappearances weren't simply murder, but offerings. And then there were the drawings. Tucked among the papers were crude sketches of the mansion's basement, windowless chambers sealed by iron doors, narrow corridors marked with symbols scrawled into the margins. One page depicted what appeared to be a circle etched into the floor, surrounded by notations of dates that matched the exact nights brides were said to have fallen ill. It was this discovery that rattled historians most, because now the disappearances weren't just the story of a cruel family hiding their crimes behind wealth. They were something ritualistic, something methodical, something meant to bind power to secrecy. Think of it, 47 brides, each arriving under cover of night, each vanishing within days, their absence explained away by frailty or illness. And all the while Cornelius documenting their disappearance not with grief but with symbols, diagrams and calculations. This is why 3 historical societies refused to authenticate the trunk, not because the documents weren't real, but because they were too real, because once you accept them as genuine, you must also accept the possibility that the Pritchard family was not simply a nest of predators, but something far worse, a family conducting rituals in the name of power, cloaked in wealth, shielded by silence. That is why the name Pritchard was scrubbed from county records, not as an accident, not as oversight, but as eras. Because what do you do with a story so dark it threatens the foundations of the institutions that covered it up? You bury it, you deny it, you pretend it never existed. By the seventh disappearance, the pattern had evolved into something beyond secrecy. It was no longer about concealing individual crimes. It was about crafting a system, a ritual of control that reached beyond the walls of the mansion. And this is where the documents from 1987 become especially unsettling. Buried among the ledgers were fragments of correspondence between Cornelius Pritchard and men in Charleston, Savannah, even New Orleans. The language was coded but deliberate, references to the continuity of stock, the preservation of order, and most chilling of all, the discipline of obedience in the female line. These weren't the words of one deranged family. They were the vocabulary of an ideology. The brides, it seems, were never random. They were selected for weakness, orphaned, indebted, sickly, or socially isolated. Cornelius called them pliant vessels. He believed that by taking the most vulnerable, breaking them swiftly, and erasing them completely, he was enacting what he described as the conditioning of the bloodline. The phrase repeats through his journals like a mantra. At first glance, it reads like madness, but think carefully. What if the ritual wasn't only for the Pritchards themselves? What if it was designed to teach the community, to condition an entire population into compliance? Consider the psychology. Each disappearance reinforced two lessons at once. To the brides, total submission meant survival, however temporary. To the townsfolk, silence meant safety. The ritual wasn't just killing women, it was killing resistance itself. And that is how control operates on the deepest level, not by extinguishing the body, but by extinguishing the will to fight. The drawings of the basement circle paired with Cornelius's notes suggest another layer. He described it as a binding chamber, not merely a place of confinement, but a plast of transformation. Words like purification, subsuming, and removal of weakness appear again and again. Some scholars who've studied the trunk argue the Pritchards believed the suffering of the brides could be transferred, that their innocence, their vitality could be harvested to fortify the line. Is that literal? Metaphorical? That's the part history refuses to answer. But here's the chilling truth. Ritual doesn't require supernatural power to be effective, it only requires belief, and the Pritchards clearly believed that 47 vanishings were not random tragedies, but deliberate steps in a design. And here's where the mirror turns toward us. The Pritchards weren't the first to use vulnerable bodies as raw material for the strengthening of the line. You see echoes of it in empires, in institutions, in experiments justified as progress, always the same pattern. Take the powerless, break them, erase the evidence, then record it in cold language that reframes atrocity as order. That's why the trunk matters, not because it proves what happened to every bride, but because it shows us the blueprint of control. Wealth shields the crime, ritual disguises the cruelty, and the community conditioned by fear becomes an accomplice. 7 brides gone, 40 left to vanish. And by now, the Pritchards weren't just predators hiding in plain sight. They were architects of silence, building a legacy not through bloodline alone, but through the obedience of everyone around them. The house was never just a home. The papers from the 1987 trunk made that clear. It was an apparatus, a structure engineered not for comfort, but for control. The basement plans, drawn in Cornelius's precise, angular hand, revealed a design that had no reason to exist in a plantation mansion. Narrow corridors, circular chambers with no windows, doors reinforced with iron. The walls lined with brick, and then packed with layers of clay and horsehair to muffle sound. These weren't the features of storage rooms, they were cells. Neighbors often remarked how the mansion seemed to swallow sound. Even in summer, when crickets shrieked and the Etowah River roared, the house itself seemed insulated, like a hollowed-out shell. That wasn't accident, it was construction. Cornelius's notes specify containment of sound to ensure purity of rite. Every brick was a barrier, every locked door a veil between ritual and discovery. Descriptions of the chambers suggest a chilling purpose. One was marked preparation, another binding. The largest was labeled silence. The sketches of silence showed a circle etched into the floor, ringed by notations: lime, ash, chalk. Around it were crude drawings of figures kneeling, arms bound. At the center, always a single figure, the candidate. Eyewitness fragments pieced together from diaries confirm what these chambers were for. Neighbors spoke of low vibrations, droning sounds that rose at night from beneath the soil. Some said it resembled chanting, others described it as humming, deep, mechanical, almost like the resonance of an organ. No music of celebration, no prayer of mourning, something else entirely. But the most disturbing accounts come from those who glimpsed the rituals directly. In 1852, a field hand wrote that he was sent to deliver firewood to the basement door. Through the crack, he claimed he saw women seated in a circle, their heads lowered, their wrists bound. Standing above them, the brothers, each holding something that glinted in the lamplight. He swore the air was thick with smoke and something sharper, the smell of iron, of blood. His account ends abruptly, cut off mid-sentence. He was never heard from again. The house itself became a stage for conditioning. Brides were confined in preparation until illness or terror weakened them. They were then taken to binding, where Cornelius wrote of restructuring the will. Finally, they entered silence, where whatever ritual was performed stripped them not only of freedom, but of existence. What exactly happened in those chambers? The documents never say outright, perhaps intentionally, but the language, transfer of vitality, securing obedience, removal of weakness, leaves little doubt. This was not simply punishment or sadism, it was ritualized erasure. And the walls remember. Even after the family line collapsed, those who trespassed in the abandoned mansion swore they felt it. The air heavy, as if every brick still carried the cries that had been smothered inside. Hunters spoke of hearing faint pounding beneath the floorboards, like fists on wood, though the rooms had been sealed for over a century. The house was not just a backdrop, it was the machine, a machine built to dismantle human will, chamber by chamber, until silence itself became the final ritual. Silence may have been the final chamber, but it was never the end. What the Pritchards perfected in their basement did not stay underground. It seeped upward, into the air, into the town, into the people who lived under its shadow. The trunk suggested that not every bride perished immediately. In several places, Cornelius wrote of candidates who faltered or subjects rendered useless. One chilling entry reads, "Released but marked. Their presence carries the memory of obedience. They will not speak." This may explain scattered rumors of women seen wandering the outskirts of the plantation, pale, vacant-eyed, as if hollowed out. Farmers' children whispered of white ladies drifting at dawn, barefoot and silent, their gowns shredded like burial shrouds. Adults dismissed these tales, but the descriptions were consistent across generations. Survivors, perhaps, not alive in any full sense, but not fully gone either. The rituals had left them altered, stripped of voice, their silence serving as both survival and testimony. The greater survivors, though, were the townspeople themselves. By the late 1850s, the community had become an extension of the Pritchard basement. Silence was no longer just enforced by walls, it lived in the people. To question the disappearances was to invite ruin. Merchants who whispered too loudly lost contracts. Preachers who hinted at corruption saw their congregations turn cold. Even children were trained. Never stare too long at the mansion. Never speak of the brides. Obedience became instinct. Psychologists who later studied the case referred to this as second-hand conditioning. You didn't need to enter the ritual chamber to be marked by it. Simply living near the Pritchards was enough. Every disappearance reinforced the same lesson. Resistance invites annihilation, and so the town behaved as though hypnotized, carrying out daily life under the weight of an unspoken pact. This is what makes the story endure, because once silence becomes communal, it becomes generational. Parents teach it to children not as fear, but as etiquette. Don't ask questions, don't dig too deep, don't disturb what is buried. By the Civil War, the town's culture of silence was so complete that even after the mansion stood empty, people still crossed the road to avoid walking too close. No one needed to enforce the ritual anymore. The people carried it within themselves. And that imprint remains the most terrifying legacy, because it shows us that control does not end when the walls collapse or the perpetrators die. The architecture of silence survives in memory, in culture, in the reflexes of those who live under its shadow. Perhaps some brides survived the chambers. Perhaps their minds, fractured by ritual, were scattered into whispers that haunted the town. But even if none lived, the effect was the same. Every disappearance was absorbed into the psychology of the community until the Pritchard plantation was no longer just a place. It was a condition. The house broke women in its chambers. The silence broke everyone else outside. By the early 1860s, the Pritchards' dominion began to unravel. The war tore through Georgia, scattering wealth and breaking the spine of old plantations. But the fall of the Pritchards was not only economic, it was something darker, as if the weight of their rituals had finally begun to rot the family from within. The last surviving journals describe a family in decline. Cornelius, once methodical, wrote erratically, his entries jagged and paranoid. He complained of voices beneath the floorboards, of faces in the mirrors that do not belong to us. The rituals, he insisted, had grown unstable. He accused his sons of disobedience, of weakening the line by succumbing to flesh rather than purpose. By 1863, the handwriting becomes almost illegible, sentences collapsing mid-thought. The last line he ever wrote: "They are still here, and they are watching." The brothers fared no better. Neighbors recorded strange sightings, men wandering the fields at night, muttering to themselves, their clothes streaked with ash. One was said to have burned his own arm with hot iron, whispering that he was cleansing the weakness. Another disappeared entirely, leaving only a blood-stained cot in the binding chamber. Whether he fled or was taken, no one knew. And then came the fire. In 1865, a blaze consumed part of the mansion's eastern wing. Officially, it was recorded as an accident sparked by lantern oil, but witnesses swore the flames began deep in the basement, rising through the floors, as if the house itself were expelling something. The fire did not destroy the mansion outright, but it scarred it permanently. Blackened beams, ceilings caved in, and a lingering stench of smoke and lime. By the end of the decade, the Pritchards were gone. Some say they fled west, others that they were taken by the very rituals they had unleashed. No graves exist, no wills, no heirs. The me simply dissolved as though erased from history by an unseen hand. The mansion stood empty, its windows staring like hollow sockets across the Etowah. Yet even in ruin, the silence held. Farmers refused to till the surrounding soil, claiming their plows struck stone where no stone should be. Travelers avoided the road at night, saying they heard muffled cries beneath the ground. In 1871, a group of boys dared each other to break into the cellar. Only one emerged, pale and trembling, repeating the same phrase over and over: "They're still waiting." He never spoke again. The county attempted to demolish the estate in 1882, but the effort faltered. Workers reported accidents, machinery failing, scaffolding collapsing without cause. After 2 deaths, the project was abandoned. The mansion was left to rot, claimed by ivy and shadow. By the turn of the century, it was less a ruin than a scar on the landscape. An unspoken warning. The collapse of the Pritchards should have ended the story. And yet it didn't. Because though the family vanished, the silence they engineered remained. It lived on in the town's reluctance to speak, in the gaps of official records, in the children who were told never to ask questions about the mansion by the river. The house burned, the family withered, but the silence endured, stronger than fire, stronger than time. By the 20th century, the mansion was less a ruin than a legend. Its blackened beams sagged under ivy, windows shattered to jagged teeth, but no one dared dismantle it. Instead, it became a landmark of absence, a hushed reminder that the Pritchards had left something behind. Paranormal interest spiked in the 1920s, when spiritualism swept the South. Mediums traveled to the property, eager to channel voices from the vanished brides. What they reported was not the chatter of spirits, but suffocating stillness. Seances ended in silence so thick that participants wept, claiming they felt words pressed against their throats, unable to escape. One medium scratched her own neck raw, whispering afterward, "They won't let me speak." During the Depression, vagrants sometimes sought shelter in the ruins. The few who survived a night inside described strange phenomena: sudden drops in temperature, the sound of chains rattling beneath the floor, disembodied humming that grew louder the closer one came to the basement stairs. Several went missing entirely, their belongings discovered neatly arranged in the preparation chamber. Local newspapers dismissed these as accidents or drifter tales, but the pattern was unmistakable. The house continued its work. In the 1950s, urban legends flourished. Teenagers dared one another to knock on the basement door. Some claimed they heard a knock returned from within. Others said the door handle grew hot, branding their palms. A handful of thrill-seekers swore they saw women's faces staring through cracked plaster, mouths moving but voiceless. These stories were dismissed as exaggeration until 1958, when 3 college students from Atlanta entered the mansion on a dare. Only 2 emerged. Their testimony was fragmented, frantic. She was there, she was real, but she couldn't scream. The 3rd student's body was never found. Attempts to investigate scientifically have fared no better. In 1974, a research group from Emory University brought recording equipment to the site. Hours of tape captured nothing but static, except for one anomaly, a low-frequency hum, steady and rhythmic, resembling a heartbeat. When played back, several members of the team reported dizziness, nausea, and an overwhelming urge to leave the property. They abandoned the project after 2 nights, their findings sealed in a university archive. Most infamous was the 1987 trunk discovery. Afterward, paranormal investigators descended on the site, eager to match the documents with physical evidence. Many returned with photographs of symbols still etched into the basement floor, faint but visible, circles of ash that resisted scrubbing even after decades of abandonment. Electronic devices failed regularly within the mansion, batteries drained, cameras jammed, and always the recordings captured the same thing: silence. Not absence of sound, but a presence of silence. A pressure that filled the room until no voice could rise above it. Today, the mansion remains fenced off, declared unsafe by the county. Yet trespassers still slip inside. Some emerge shaken, refusing to discuss what they saw. Others never return at all. The official reports list structural collapses, accidents, animal attacks. But locals know better. They whisper that the silence has grown stronger, that it no longer needs the Pritchards to feed it. Because silence is never empty. In the Pritchard house, silence is the last bride, waiting still. The story of the Pritchard Brides has often been told as tragedy, sometimes as horror, occasionally as folklore, but beneath every version runs the same thread: silence. It began as an instrument of control in the basement chambers, spread into the surrounding community, and now lingers like a residue on the land itself. The true haunting is not the faces in broken windows or the knocks beneath the floorboards. It is the silence that persists. Historians search for facts: how many women were taken, how the family vanished, whether the fire was deliberate. Paranormal investigators chase evidence, shadows, recordings, frequencies that cannot be explained, but perhaps both miss the point. The Pritchards did not merely destroy lives, they engineered a condition. Their rituals were not just spectacles of cruelty, they were blueprints for erasure. What survives is not proof, but absence, not answers, but gaps where answers should be. Consider what has lasted. The names of most brides are lost, their graves are unmarked, their voices never recorded in testimony or letter, yet their silence echoes still, in rumors, in warnings, in the instinctive unease of those who pass the ruined house. It is not memory in the traditional sense, but something heavier. An inherited hush pressed into the marrow of the community. Generations who never knew the Pritchards still lower their voices when speaking of the mansion. Children still dare each other to enter, only to return shaken, unable to describe why. The silence has outlived the family that forged it. This is what makes the haunting enduring. Most specters fade when the house falls, when time carries the last witnesses to their graves. But silence does not require witnesses. Silence is its own preservation. It feeds on the absence of speech, on the refusal to question, on the fear of being the one who breaks it. And so long as no one names the truth directly, the haunting thrives. The 1987 trunk was perhaps the first real fracture. For once, the silence broke open, if only briefly, and the mechanisms of the rituals came to light. But even then, the discovery led not to answers, but to deeper unease. The documents confirmed what locals already felt, that something was done in those chambers which still resists words. And even scholars, trained to dissect the past, write of the case with restraint, hedging every statement with doubt. The silence reasserts itself, even in print. In the end, perhaps the Pritchards' greatest success was not their domination of brides, nor their manipulation of ritual. It was their transformation of silence into a living force. They weaponized it, embedded it, and left it behind as their legacy. Fire could not consume it, time could not erode it, death could not bury it, and that is the warning. The danger is not only in what happened in the mansion, but in what still happens when silence goes unbroken. Because silence, once given power, does not remain confined to basements or ruins. It spreads, it lingers, it waits. The Pritchards are gone, the house is crumbling, but the silence endures, and in that silence, the last bride is never freed. If the silence of the Pritchards ended with their ruin, this would be a ghost story, but the persistence of their legacy suggests something larger. Silence does not remain where it was birthed. It spreads, it contaminates, it rewrites those who come near it. Accounts from researchers illustrate this contagion. In 2004, a graduate student compiling oral histories of Bartow County noted a strange pattern. Each interviewee, no matter how talkative about other topics, would fall into abrupt quiet when asked about the mansion. Sometimes they shook their heads, sometimes they changed the subject, sometimes they simply stopped speaking altogether, the recorder humming with empty air. The student later remarked in her field notes that she too began avoiding the subject, not from disbelief but from what she described as a heaviness in the throat, as though words resisted being formed. Paranormal groups tell similar stories. Visitors arrive prepared, armed with cameras, recorders, meters. But within minutes of entering the ruins, enthusiasm decays into muttering, hesitation, and silence. More than one group has reported arguments breaking out afterward, friendships dissolving. Silence does not just suppress speech, it erodes connection. By isolating people, it replicates itself. Even the documents from the trunk carry this mark. Archivists who handled the papers in 1987 described nausea, headaches, nightmares. One admitted privately that he avoided speaking at work for weeks, finding comfort only in quiet. He could not explain why, only that it felt safer not to stir the air. Scholars later noted how few articles were actually published from the find, despite its historical significance. The research stalled, suspended in a haze of unfinished drafts and academic hesitation. The silence bled into the very study of silence. This is why some call the Pritchard haunting not a haunting at all, but an infection. Unlike most legends, it is not tied only to place. The house amplifies it, yes. Its chambers still hum with it. But the silence follows paper, memory, even speech about the subject. Every retelling risks carrying the weight further. To speak of the Pritchards is to brush against the edges of their design. And perhaps this was always the true intent. Cornelius wrote that obedience is most perfect when self-enforced. What better system than silence itself? Not imposed by chains or threats, but carried willingly, even unknowingly, by those who fear what breaking it might unleash. The house did not simply teach obedience to brides, it trained obedience into the world beyond its walls, which raises the final, unsettling question. How much silence in our own lives is ordinary, and how much is inherited? Every unasked question, every swallowed truth, every instinct to look away, is it simply human nature, or is it the residue of rituals designed long ago in a Georgia basement? The mansion rots, the ivy thickens, and the roof sinks into itself. But silence, once born, does not need walls. It has us. It lingers in our reluctance, in our fear, in our obedience to nothing but quiet. The Pritchards may be gone, their rituals may be ash, but the silence, their silence, is already everywhere. You have read the accounts. You have walked in words through the chambers of preparation, binding and silence. You have followed the Pritchards from their rise to their ruin, from the ash of their rituals to the ivy-choked ruin by the Etowah. And yet, even now, something remains unfinished. Because the silence does not end on the page. It has always waited for someone to carry it further. That was the Pritchards' genius, or their curse. They did not need heirs to pass on their legacy. They created something self-sustaining, something that grows wherever it is acknowledged. And in reading this, in letting your eyes move across these words, you have allowed their silence to brush against you. Perhaps you felt it already, that brief pause when you hesitated before turning to the next sentence, the small weight pressing down at the edge of your awareness, the part of you that wonders whether to keep going or whether it might be safer to stop here. That is how it begins, not with screams or apparitions, but with the awareness of silence and the discomfort it brings. For silence, once noticed, becomes difficult to ignore. It spreads into rooms, into conversations, into the gaps between questions you never asked. You may leave this story and go on with your day, close the book, shut the file, turn away. But when you sit in a quiet room, you may find yourself listening harder than before, wondering if the stillness is just emptiness or if it is watching you back. That is the final bride, not a woman bound beneath the Pritchards' house, but silence itself, waiting to be joined, waiting to be obeyed. The rituals are gone, the symbols scattered, but their logic remains. Speak less, question less, accept the hush as safety. That was always the lesson, always the trap. Some insist that silence can be broken, that to name it, to tell the story aloud, weakens its hold. Others argue the opposite, that every retelling strengthens it, giving it new voices to suppress, new rooms to inhabit. The truth may lie somewhere between, but consider carefully now what you will do. Will you repeat what you've read, or will you keep it quiet, as the Pritchards always intended? The house by the river is still there, its blackened bones sinking into earth. Few dare approach, but those who do say the same thing. It is not the sight of the ruin that unnerves them, nor even the thought of what was done there. It is the silence inside, heavy and unnatural, pressing against their ribs until breath itself feels like a trespass. They say if you stay long enough, the silence begins to feel like home. And perhaps that is the final warning. The danger is not that the silence will frighten you. The danger is that one day you will welcome it.